And the item focuses on three pillars of privacy: transparency or disclosure, choice or consent, and security. And the item includes within security both data security and data breach notification. So on transparency, the item proposes that customers should be provided information about what information their ISP collects and how it uses it, and be given the opportunity, and how consumers can exercise choice. I think it's fair to say the choice component of the proposal is the most controversial. It proposes generally that customers' information is their own and they should be able to control use of their information by their broadband provider. It looks to the FTC's proposed privacy framework and identifies consumer expectation as the defining principle for how customer information should be treated. There is some information the proposal suggests that customers have agreed to allow their broadband providers to use, or instances in which they've allowed them to use their information by signing up for the service. So when you sign up for an ISP, you're obviously consenting to have the ISP use your information to take you to the internet and bring internet traffic back to you. There are also some other expectations within Section 222 itself, and some other proposed expectations that the item suggests are inherent in the broadband provider-customer relationship. The second sort of tier of choice is opt-out consent. So that is that the broadband provider would be able to use their customers' information, but allow customers to choose to opt out of such uses of that information. And the types of uses that the proposal suggests treating as subject to opt-out consent are marketing purposes, and specifically marketing for communications-related services by the ISP or by an affiliate of the ISP that provides communications-related services. So you would see this in a typical triple play scenario. I purchase broadband services from an ISP. They want to wireline broadband services from an ISP. They want to market wireless ISP services to me, or voice services to me, and they could use my customer information, my information as a customer of the broadband provider, to market those services to me, subject to opt-out consent, is what the proposal recommends. And third is, opt-in. And everything else would fall under opt-in.
I think the way that I read the NPRM's proposal, it actually largely tries to fit certain information that broadband internet access providers obtain to the extent possible into the CP&I framework, with some updating, but basically fitting into the three-tier opt-in, broad opt-in, narrow opt-out for certain practices, and then certain practices are considered to be expected by consumers by nature of the service. On the data security and the breach notice side, I'll just describe how this really is wildly different than the way that law works in those areas. And I'd also add, just with regard to privacy as well, that there's an odd sort of shoehorning of what would be CP&I if one were to try to translate the definition of CP&I into the broadband context, that winds up focusing on information that really is not very sensitive, or not sensitive at all, and the order winds up kind of bizarre. Proposed order winds up bizarrely not regulating content. It proposes questions about having greater requirements for content, and not really addressing deep packet inspection. Again, that's left as an additional possible topic for comment. I'd submit that those were the issues, the privacy issues that were of concern with regard to ISPs 5 years ago, and that this exercise of trying to figure out what would be the equivalent of CP&I on the broadband side winds up putting the cart before the horse and really focusing on things that don't matter very much to consumers in a way that I think would wind up being confusing and creating some other problems. But more fundamentally, there's no risk of harm here. And there's as a requirement for notice to be required. Furthermore, there's an access requirement. Only 3 states have access as the trigger for notice, and they all have harm triggers that both go out the window here. So we're in a world of detailed accountings to the FCC about times that somebody got into a CP&I database with special expenditures of money to have the audit logging to do this. But anytime garden variety name or address information is accessed, even though it's publicly available on the internet, the broadband ISP is supposed to contact the FCC and possibly the Secret Service and FBI when there are more than 5,000 customers' information that's affected here. This sort of garden variety information should not be the subject of breach notice requirements. And it really, I think, calls into question whether the whole CP&I architecture really makes sense in this context, as opposed to activities that I described like contents of communications being breached or deep packet inspection occurring on the privacy side. These are things that really matter to consumers and really matter as a matter of privacy and the overall framework of privacy and information security law. And given that these are operators of critical infrastructure, putting these obligations and risks on them for information that creates no risk whatsoever is really a distraction from much more important security responsibilities. It gets to the level of being really bad cybersecurity policy because we want these operators to be protecting their networks rather than worrying about every piece of information that might be linkable to an individual customer. Under the 2012 FTC Privacy Staff Report, which is referenced multiple times in the NPRM, businesses may use consumer data for many marketing and advertising purposes based on implied or opt-out consent. Opt-in consent is required only for use or disclosure of particularly sensitive data or for purposes that really differ drastically from the purposes for which information was collected in the first place, unless there's clear notice to consumers warning the consumer of that. Here, all that goes out the window. It's opt-in in all circumstances, even when there's clear notice to consumers when they're signing up for service or a notice that's unavoidable and floated to consumers. That's very, very different. Similarly, under ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Statute, there's no restriction at all on internal uses by ISPs of customer information, nor is there a restriction on video rental companies who can know all the weird movies that people watched of advertising to those individuals under the Video Privacy Protection Act. Financial services firms can use sensitive financial data for advertising, and even if we look at the really stringent EU general privacy regulation, which is designed to be a model of stringent privacy regulation for the rest of the world, internal uses of information to advertise to existing customers do not require even notice or require notice, but not opt-in or opt-out consent. Finally, the granular sort of notice that would be required under the NPRM of how the bias provider uses and under what circumstances it discloses each type of customer PII that it collects would be a major departure from the short-form notice practices that the FTC Privacy Staff Report encourages, and that's very, very much what consumers can understand. The net result is probably going to be consumers being pretty confused by these notices, having choice only with respect to a certain type of collection of information, not understanding the difference of that between other forms of collection that may occur on the internet, and then having opt-in consent apply for example, ISPs offering their customers additional over-the-top content at a discounted price with their bundle, or offering alarm monitoring services. Again, these are not the sort of things that typically would require opt-in consent or trigger heavy security requirements. So anyway, that's just an example of how this order, I think, builds on a framework that is very, very particular with regard to CP&I, but really doesn't make sense for the internet.
I'll also start with a point of consensus, which is I think most people agree that there's a value to having a governmental cop on the beat. The question is whether those cops should be enforcing different laws for different competitors in the same ecosystem. And the NPRM addresses that issue in passing in paragraph 132. It says, quote, "We recognize that edge providers are not subject to the same regulatory framework and that this regulatory disparity could have competitive ripple effects." The first reason, the FCC says, well, not to worry. We have three reasons why we think this regulatory disparity will be attenuated. The first is, as it points out, that edge providers are subject to the FTC's privacy regime. But of course, the difference is that the FTC's privacy regulation is more flexible and much less prescriptive than the FCC's, and more importantly, the FTC's initiatives under Section 5 of the FTC Act are confined to its deception authority, in which it polices breaches of promises, either explicit or implicit, and its unfairness authority, where by statute it is required under Section 5N of the FTC Act to conduct what could loosely be called a cost-benefit analysis. The FTC's emphasis on conducting cost-benefit analysis is absent from the NPRM. There are nods to it, but it is plainly not the focus of the FCC's initiative. Number two is a reason why the FCC says not to worry about these regulatory disparities. Edge providers, they say, are, quote, increasingly adopting opt-in regimes for sharing of some types of sensitive information. Well, that's laudable, and it's a great idea to be doing that, and everyone should really be doing that. But the problem with the FCC's proposal is that it doesn't stop there. I mean, unlike the existing privacy regime that we have, which is calibrated to differences in the sensitivity of consumer information, the FCC would essentially preclude the use of all consumer information for non-communication services by ISPs. So there's no real distinction between sensitive versus non-sensitive information. There is this distinction between communications-related services and non-communications-related services. If you're an ISP and you want to use information for communications-related services, that is a flexible opt-out regime. If, however, you want to use it for this amorphous and quite huge category of non-communications related services, then you're subject to an inflexible opt-in requirement irrespective of how sensitive the data at issue is. That distinction between communications related services and non-communications related services might have been fairly based in consumer expectations in the telephone world of the mid-1990s, but we now live in a fairly interconnected internet ecosystem where consumers do not distinguish as sharply among the different types of services that they can use. Third, the FCC says, don't worry about the regulatory and competitive disparity in our rules, and this is really the nub of the item, because, quote, edge providers only have because there's more of a need, according to the FCC. Quote, edge providers only have direct access to the information that customers choose to share with them by virtue of engaging their services. In contrast, broadband providers have direct access to potentially all customer information, unquote. So both halves of that sentence are problematic. As an initial matter, outside specialized context, most consumers never in any meaningful sense choose to share information with edge providers, such as their Android operating system or their mobile apps. But they routinely, those edge providers routinely collect enormous volumes of information, some of which could be deemed sensitive about consumers, and that information, subject to sector-specific regulations such as HIPAA or Grand Leach, Bliley, are bought and sold regularly by data brokers. The internet ecosystem knows a great deal about all of us. The reason is that, for the most part, edge providers are not subject to sort of inflexible privacy rules that the FCC proposes here. And by the way, I just want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with edge providers doing this. This is a source of great value creation in the modern economy. There's a reason why Google has the largest market cap of any company. It's because knowing data about consumers is a source of great efficiency and value creation in the modern economy. So I'm not trying to disparage anything that the edge providers do. I'm just wondering why the edge providers, why we would want to live in a world where one sector of the connected internet ecosystem is subject to much more rigorous regulation than all other sectors. The other half of the FCC's empirical proposition about ISP omniscience vis-a-vis edge providers is also flawed. As many people in the room know, Peter Swire just issued a white paper in which he explained the technology underlying what edge providers see and compared it to what ISPs see. ISPs, it turns out, are far less omniscient than many people believe, in part for a variety of different reasons. One is, in the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations, it has become increasingly and rapidly popular for the leading websites to encrypt the data flowing between their customers and themselves.
I think why I'm here and what my comparative advantage is, I think, on the panel, although John nailed the economic theory part, is as an economist and a FTC person. And with both of those hats on, I read the NPRM and with great interest. And so I'll spend most of my time talking about what I think is missing from the discussion of the FTC's approach to privacy in the NPRM and sort of maybe generally. I said I think I got in a little bit of trouble for this when I was commissioner. It was frowned upon by some of my colleagues, but in Congress I said something along the lines of the open internet order being the equivalent of taking the FTC's jurisdictional lunch money. And I thought that the agency should be a little bit more vigorous ex ante and going screaming and kicking into the night, and was a little bit disappointed that we did not. So I was trying to think about if the open internet order was getting our lunch money taken, what this is. I think this is bringing our lunch the next day and having it taken too, but having the FCC be really nice about it. We're cited 50 times. They compliment us on the sandwich we made. While they ate it, but they still ate it. So let me talk a little bit about why that is. We're cited 50 or so times, and it's largely through mapping the FTC's privacy approach onto stuff in the 2012 privacy report. Fair enough, it's our privacy report. Things like consumer choice and transparency and privacy by design and the like. A very important part about FTC, consumer protection enforcement generally, but privacy in particular, is that those concepts are read through the prism of economic analysis required in the deception authority, misrepresentation or omission to consumer's detriment, and through the unfairness standard, which John already spoke about, but requires a cost-benefit analysis. Both the unfairness authority and the deception authority at the FTC and the privacy actions that we have taken, and we've been quite active in that regard. See, I left and I still say we. I'm going to stop that.
It'll take 5 years.
It hasn't taken me that long.
I'll get notes from you later. And in case I screw up, every time I say something other than NPRM, I mean NPRM. So
Thank you. The item.
the item. So when the FTC brings privacy enforcement actions either through deception or unfairness, those standards underlying the FTC's enforcement and policy practice in the area require economic analysis. There are 50-something, low 50s, industrial organization economists, PhD economists inside the FTC's Bureau of Economics who, by my measure, are probably the best collection of professional economists in any government regulatory agency in the country. Importantly, they work on all the consumer protection cases. Now, sometimes your job is easy. It's plain, simple fraud. You don't need a PhD in economics to say, hey, that's bad. So they write a really short memo that says, hey, that's bad. But in really tough cases in particular, the economists are engaged to help walk us through what the right analysis is. In an unfairness case, is the cost-benefit test satisfied? In a deception case, where's the harm? Sometimes how big is the harm? We may want to know for sort of other reasons. Point being, those concepts, privacy by design, which does this mean privacy design at any cost? Does it mean if the costs of incorporating privacy by design are less than the benefits, we should do it anyway? FTC's economic approach has a fairly straightforward answer to that question. But the important part is that economic and empirical approach is in the DNA of the FTC's privacy approach. I'm an economist. Sometimes I criticize the agency for saying we should hand over, sort of more of the reins to the economists. It's what I think, and I got outvoted sometimes on those proposals. But the complaint is never that the approach is non-economic altogether. That brings me to the NPRM, which I think is non-economic altogether. And I think that is really the core problem, and we can sort of translate that into the gap between the legal authorities, the gap in between the unfairness statement and fairness authority of the FTC as applied versus what's in the NPRM, or the deception authority as applied and what's in the NPRM. The root cause of this, I think, is that so far as I can tell, the NPRM adopts what I think is a fairly sort of non-economic approach to these same issues.
Really appreciate John and Josh's thoughtful comments. They're, I think, they help move the discussion forward in ways that are very positive. I would take issue a little bit with a couple of things they said. So John suggested that the item precludes the use of information for certain purposes. It doesn't do that. So, well, I don't speak for the chairman. I will channel the chairman
said
here.
without opt-in, at least I
Okay,
maybe
so,
that's-
right,
yeah.
so the item is set up so that the consumers have the choice. So I realize, and, and Josh is a governing principle, there are barriers to opt in from the company's perspective, but it is always the customer's choice. It's not a preclusion. And to the issue of pay for privacy or incentives, the item does not propose to ban incentives. It seeks comment on it in large part because of the complex issues there. And I really hope that we can get people to engage on that issue because I think you do a nice job sort of previewing all of the challenging issues there, most of which are sound and economic issues and choice issues. And there's been some research around it, but it is, as you said, a very complicated issue.